Hello everybody and welcome to OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today I'm here with Joe. We're going to do a discussion video on the ECC, a tournament coming up in a few weeks time. I think it's 3 or 4 weeks time from now. And it's just it's also kind of a cities roundup as well. The format is standard, so this is going to be a standard discussion, but we are looking into doing an expanded discussion relatively soon as well, just because we've got some expanded regionals over here in the UK coming up. So in a couple of weeks' time, you will indeed be getting an expanded discussion, but for now we're just going to keep it standard. So I'm going to kick it off with Night March. We're just going to go over sort of the front runners first, and then we'll perhaps look into some more rogue concepts. But yeah, Night March, you all know what Night March does. It's little 30 and 60 HP Pokemon that do huge damage. Two real ways of playing it at the moment are Bronzong and Milotic. Both have inherent strengths and weaknesses. Depending on the meta, it's kind of weird how the Bronzong and Milotic sort of plays out, considering Bronzong gives you more consistent and more rounded matchups, but the Milotic is a more consistent deck. Milotic, the one from Primal Clash, letting you get a card back from your discard pile when you drop it from your hand to evolve a Feebas. You're pretty much going to be aiming for DCEs mainly with this, but it does have the versatility of using it as another VS Seeker or just another Night March or whatever you need for that turn. But yeah, it's a lot more consistent because of that ability, meaning that you do have a 5th VS Seeker, you do have a 5th DCE, things like that. But it's much more reliant on special energy. You'll more often than not in Milotic lists see 4 DCE as the only energy, and that can in itself be an issue, just because of all of the special energy hate out there at the moment. There's, looking down the front runners list we've got here, pretty much everything is running special energy, so anything that preys on special energy is going to naturally have a pretty good time at the ECC. So yeah, the Milotic sort of way of playing it is more consistent, but it is more reliant on special energy. Bronzong obviously letting you Metal Links back metals from the discard. Therein lies the get around against things like Tina and Entei, because both really enjoy a special energy heavy metagame, doing more, either locking your opponent or reducing the amount of damage you take. So it has better matchups, but because it doesn't have that versatility of the Milotic's ability, it can actually be a less consistent deck, even though it has better matchups than pretty much the same deck, just with a different tech option. But I think both are pretty strong at the moment. Night March is Night March. Night March has always been strong, and going into the new set, it only gets better. Night March is pretty much always going to be a relatively solid play, just because it has the 2 words Night March in it. It's always going to be a pretty good play, I think.
Yeah, we know exactly what it does. It's super speedy. It can prey on anything EX. The Milotic builds may be favored just because you have like the 3 extra slots that you're not playing of energy, and you also have, like, if you're playing the Bronzong build, you need to play Buddy Buddy Rescue at least one. I played it the other day and I had to play 1 Revive, 1 Buddy Buddy, just because I was worried that I'd run out of Night Marches, but still needed the immediate damage. So you sort of earn yourself 5 extra slots by playing Milotic, but it does open you up to, like you were saying, the special energy hate. So the Milotic gives you that option to play like the 1 target whistle, the 1 megaphone, a few extra random techs that can help you out in certain matchups. But Bronzong's more of the safe play. But yeah, like you say, just winning prize trade is what Night March does, and it's pretty good at it. So it'll probably be up there. Next up, let's talk about Yveltal Zoroark Gallade. It's a really good deck. It has a plethora of different attackers that you can play. The baby Yveltal, you probably want to play at least 2 of those guys just to deal with Night March effectively, a single dark energy, and you're also setting up other attackers. You obviously have the Zoroark to give you free retreat on everything with Stand-In plus Floatstone, and he also offers really good attacks with Mind Jack, and if you want to play the break, you can. It can help out random matchups like Magomanetric and stuff, and Giratina really helps out against Giratina. You can even use Quaking Punch from other Toad players and have a really favourable exchange there. So if you feel greedy and want to play the break, you can play 1 because it can help out a few matchups. You basically, against Night March, have to go all non-EX, and there are a few matchups that go like that, because you have the Zoroark, you have the baby Yveltal, you also have Gallade if you're able to get him out. So you can almost play as a full non-EX deck. You really only need like two Yveltal EXs in there. That's mainly for like mirror matches. It also helps out against Lucario bats really nicely, and against Seismitoad for your actual just raw damage. It's still really good just for turning around. But yeah, I think a lot more Yveltal Gallades are playing Seismitoad itself now. That's because of its slightly dodgy Entei matchup, just on paper, because Entei is difficult to take down in one hit, especially because that deck really is reliant on DCE, like Zoroark, Gallade, and Yveltal doesn't need it, but it pretty much does for its output. So Entei can really prey on it, and it hits the 170s quite easily every time. So without Toad, I think that deck struggles against Entei, and it's also going to struggle against Manectric. You have to worry about playing Gallade because there'll be games when you just miss Gallade. It's just a fact that it's not very consistent in standard. I don't think you can get it higher than 70% to get it out a game, and that's really going full on like four ovs of everything. The compressors, the ultra balls, the males, the acros. You're still just going to hit around 70-ish% of getting it out, and you don't want to lose rounds just because you missed Gallade and there's nothing else in your deck that can deal with it. So it's a consideration for the deck, but overall it has a lot of versatility and a lot of different attackers. And when Gallade gets out, it's a completely different deck to when it doesn't, because you have so much better top decks and you hit Lysander, you hit DCE the turns you need them. So it's pretty awesome when it is fully functioning.
Yeah, Gallade is inherently such a strong support Pokemon, so any deck that can really benefit from it, I think Yveltal does the best in benefiting from it, just because of, like you say, the natural output it's got and the fact it can be so versatile in itself anyway. When it then has the versatility of being able to sort of choose its top decks and stuff, it gets even better. So moving on, speaking of Entei Charizard, I'll go on to that next. More often than not, you're going to be seeing Entei Charizard Pyro, I think, now, just because in the Entei Charizard Pyro dipped a little bit and it's coming back into favour, but with the Pyro, with some not the exact same list as it used to play. It's a little bit different now. But again, you're probably pretty familiar as to what Entei is good at, and that's attaching to Assault Vest, so anything that has a DC or a special energy on it, and having the HP of an EX, but only giving up one prize, and then also sort of reducing the amount of damage you do to it through its attack, and then still being able to do huge output. There's so many pros of Entei. And as we've been saying so far, and you'll come to realise over the next few decks we talk about, special energy is everywhere at the moment. There is no... It was at the start of the format. I would imagine it will be towards the end of the format, just because of how much, or how many different special energy we have at the moment, and how many different DC attackers we have at the moment. Special energy is everywhere. And that's why Entei is doing so well at the moment. It's reducing 80 a turn just from attaching two tools. Then it can reduce 110 if it uses Flame Screen, which is relatively easy to set up using Blacksmith, and you can even set up, I can't remember what the second attack's called, but you
Flame
can
charge.
Flame Charge. Yeah, it sounds
Heat tackle. Heat tackle.
Heat Tackle. But you can set that up in a turn with with access to Blacksmith and DCE. Doing 170 on turn 1 basically you can do, which is sort of madness. It's a good deck. It actually surprisingly struggles with Vespiquen Vileplume, which is another deck we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But you would think it would naturally have quite a good matchup because of the weakness, but you don't get access to your tools, and Entei is all about having the tools. And without the tools, it's a lot more difficult to deal with the Vespiquens as nicely as they can deal with you, because they can much more consistently one-shot you. If you can't play your tools down, you have to two-shot them, unless you're attaching 4 energy. And if you have time to attach 4 energy, then they probably have the same amount of time to set up another Vespiquen, or if they've got the Vileplume out as well. Your deck is just going to be so much more inconsistent. And the same kind of thing happens with Toad. If your item locked as Entei, it's a lot more difficult just because you don't have access to these tools. Entei is completely reliant on the tools to do well, and if you can lock them out of the tools, it can be a real tough ride for Entei, because without the tools, Entei is a really kind of mediocre card.
Yeah, definitely. It's so reliant on its trainer engine that it's there lies its weakness because there's two really great ways of getting trainer lock into play really early on. Toad obviously hits for weakness. Obviously, as long as they get vests on early, they can do well for initial prize trade. They can't one hit Toad though, so they need to like flame screen then hit DCE. So it's not ideal, but as long as like if they can keep those on, obviously Toads are probably going to play Megaphone or at least Erosic. So once those tools do die down, your deck is just you're not really drawing any cards other than from Scorched Earth, I guess. And because you're so your deck is like full of trainers. So even Shaman's not getting you cards because you can't lower your hand size for Shaman. So you're getting like no cards from that deck, and it's basically if you can hit the blacksmiths and the DCs, but most of the time you can't just because there's so few of them in your deck overall. And yeah, I agree with the Vestricon Vileplume. It's not completely favored, just because it has so few actual Pokemon in the deck. You're so reliant on Ultra Ball to not get benched that that deck can beat you in literally a turn, as long as again you miss vests or if you're going second or whatever. So it's really weak to those things. I don't think the Pyro is a staple. I think it's more of a tech choice. It's started to grow in popularity a little bit here and there. As like sometimes a 2-2 of, sometimes it's like a 4-4 Pyro, and you also just have the option of going crazy Charizard in one turn, just for some explosive power. And Pyro is just, it's going to do really well against Night March. It's going to do well against Toad. It's going to do well against things that just don't have enough Hex Maniacs to get through your Pyros. So most things are playing Hex, thankfully. So Pyro is not like the be all and end all once you get it out, but it can sometimes buy you a few turns, and a few turns can help you win prize trade because that deck's already really good at winning prize trades. So yeah, I think it's a decent choice. It's just really limited in what it can do. Like you have to play blacksmith every turn, basically to keep up. So you don't often you're really limited to your own deck as to what it can do, as opposed to having lots of flexibility that other decks can give you. So onto Manectric Crobat now, a deck that is really flexible, a very fast deck as well. Overrun is a really good initial attack when you combine it with Crobats. It gives you a strong Night March matchup, at least slightly favourable, especially if people are playing Feebasses over Bronzors. You basically limit their Milotics all game, and you're just going to win prize trade with enough bat drops with the addition of overrun damage. So you should win that matchup fairly comfortably. You have weakness on Yveltal. Even if they are able to develop Gallade, you have muscle-banded Crobats to respond on the Gallade. You have to make sure that as soon as Gallade comes down, that's where you spend your bat drops. You need to get the initial 50 onto the Gallade so that when you are able to Lysander or to kill the Manectric, then you can just go muscle band Crobat kill and carry on with your strategy, because it's rare that they can go Gallade and then the next turn come back with another Gallade. So you have to sort of just get over the initial hump, and then you should be able to just win prize trade with typing. You also have like Miltank, who's a decent attacker, can hit like 100 with muscle band with bat drops, which gets crazy. So it has good non-EXs to even play just to attack. In those matchups where it's less favourable to use Manectric, like Lucario bats. Again, Crobat with Muscle Band becomes one of your best attackers. Miltank is also nice because it forces them out of Hawlucha. They have to go to Lucario. So it has a lot of cute plays that it can do. Having such a thick stage 2 line can be awkward. Like you're normally playing a 4-4-2 or a 4-4-3, a 3-3-3, something like that. Of the bats, that naturally gives you a lot of clunk. So sometimes you're not as quick as you'd like to be. And it's kind of weak to Hex as well at the same time. Sometimes Hex March can win just by doing enough Hex Maniacs to get you through. So it's not completely amazing. It also has a difficult Entei because you rarely are able to one-hit. Definitely, because you have no acceleration, you can't really keep up with the Entei player. So those are its most difficult matchups. I think Mega Manectric is 50-50, depending on if you hit Headringers before they start using their Megas attacks, because then they start overwhelming you with attackers turn after turn that do more than yours. So it's not completely fantastic, but it does have a lot going for it. And it's seeing a lot of love in the UK right now, just to really keep Night March on the down.
Yeah, it's doing a really good job of that. Night Match has definitely sort of dropped in play recently, and I think Manectric Crobat is one of the biggest reasons why. Moving on to the other sort of style of Manectric, we've got Mega Manectric with some sort of attackers. You can either go for like down a Psychic route or a Water route. So the Psychic route is often going to play like Wobbuffets, mainly. Well, the Wobbuffets are incredible just for stopping abilities. Abilities are still really, really important in both standard and expanded, especially with things like we've said, Milotic is really good, Gallade is really good. All of these things can be shut off just by having a Yveltal, Wobbuffet active, and then if you've got inbuilt energy acceleration as well, which can deal with anything that tries to sort of outpace your energy, so you can sort of fill your board with attackers, which is really nice. But the sort of better route as far as tech attackers goes, if you don't mind giving up the fact that you won't have ability lock, sort of on your opponent's side of the field as well, is the water route. Regice, obviously we know how good Regice is against a heavy EX format, and whilst it's not as heavy as it once used to be, Regice can still put in work if you see enough EXs all day, just because its second attack can really shut off pretty much anything EXs can do. They have to use their Lysanders to get around the Regice, and if they're using their Lysanders to get around the Regice, they're not dealing with Regice itself, which means you can just carry on sort of doing this semi-lock with Regice, which is nice. Again, it's got inbuilt acceleration to try and deal with anything that tries to outpace it, because you can sort of fill your board with attackers like you can with Mega Manectric anyway. Things like little weird things like Headringer and stuff will always be an issue for Mega Manectric, just because you can't get your Mega Manectric out as easily, and it turns into a more inconsistent Manectric deck just because you don't have the energy acceleration. But if you can grab your Spirit Links and your Megas early enough, it's not too much of an issue. Raichu Bats is probably one of the roughest matchups, just because they're both the decks are relatively similar. They do a lot of damage, and then sort of have a very sort of varied attacker like output. But the Raichu is a non-EX at the end of the day, and Mega Manectric is an EX, and Raichu can, with the Bats, can actually reach one-shotting Mega Manectric. It's difficult, but it can be done, and that can really put you like a step or two behind. Mega Manectric does have much nicer math, because you always one-shot the Raichus no matter what, and you don't need to rely on your own Bats or anything like that. But Raichu can still be rough just because it's so consistent, and if you've got a consistent list, it's really consistent, and it can actually deal with. It's one of the only decks that can deal with Mega Manectric semi-reliably if you can grab your pieces at the right time. Night March is another deck that can really reach, but it can one-shot Mega Manectrics. But if you're playing Articuno, that can definitely even out the board a little bit, just because the Articunos against Joltix, it's pretty much certain you're going to be taking 2 prizes on a Joltik, as long as you've got semi-decent flips. I think you only need 1 to be able to take 2 prizes on a Joltik, which is really, really important in the Night March matchup, just because they can reach and knock out Mega Manectrics a little bit easier than Raichu can. But even so, I think Mega Manectric is definitely an interesting play, and there are multiple ways of playing it, like I've said, the Psychic way and the more water way, really.
Yeah, I really like Mega Man. Like, it's still got all the good things going for it. It's got HP that can get out of Charizard Entei's range, which is kind of nice. And if you want to go down the water route, you can have weakness with Articuno, which can help you win prize trade there, because you're avoiding knockouts on the Mega, and then you're taking extra ones on the Entei. Like, you're not playing special energy, so you always hit through them, thanks to weakness. If you play the Psychic stuff, you can deal with Yveltal Gallade really easily, because you've got the Psychic things for Gallade, and there you go. Also, the Wobbuffet, it gives you good, like, Vespiquen Vileplume, gives you really good Entei if you lead with it. Just if you lead with Wobbuffet, you have so many better matchups, because they just don't set up as they like to set up. So I don't know how many Wobbuffet you'd have to play for it to really get a big payoff. I've seen a lot of lists just like 2. I think that is the best sort of compromise. Like, you just accept that you're not going to start with it a lot. But even if you just go first and find like Floatstone, get into it early, it's still effective. So I do like Mega Man still. Onto Lucario Bats. It's one of these veterans that's been around forever. Lucario Bats, I mean, it's got a decent night march because you can use Focus Sash to sort of keep in the game, and you're using bat drops just like you do with Manectric Bats, really. But Focus Sash really keeps you in it. Missile Jab hits through the resistance that Pumpkaboo has, so it's actually fairly easy to knock them out each turn. You have stuff like Horlucha in more awkward matchups like Yveltal. The biggest thing for Lucario Bats players to get over is the baby Yveltals. Those are the biggest issues. So not the most favourable matchup for you, but it's manageable really. Entezard, you have 180 HP, so that's pretty decent. You actually can tank hits. Even if they are going to Giovanni you, you can have the Focus Sash back up anyway. You unfortunately can't one-hit them very easily. Like you are reliant on strong energy to do good damage, but it does have the Karina engine, so you can play one-offs of like Enhanced Hammer and Startling Megaphone to help you out on those ups. So it has the sort of inbuilt engine where you can have techie one-offs to help matchups like Charizard Entei. Manectric Bats, I don't think it's more than a 50-50. As long as you know the matchup, though, you can do well. I think Mega Man is a stronger matchup. The Psychic Techs, yes, they can be an issue, but again, Sash can make things so much nicer for you. The only issue is, are you able to actually take out that Psychic Pokemon the next turn? It might be one of those situations where Crobat becomes your favorite attacker. It has, yeah, it doesn't really appreciate Toadina. That's a deck we've not really spoken much about so far, but Toadina can be a thorn in a lot of the deck sides that we've been talking about, and Lucario Bats is probably one of the most affected because Strong Energy, Muscle Band, Stadium, where's that's all of its output gone in a single Chaos Wheel. So, yeah, it really struggles against Toadina. That's probably its hardest matchup.
Yeah, I think, like you say, Lucario Bats is a bit of a veteran, so you know you're you're gonna have an okay day with it no matter what, just because you know we all know the deck is naturally quite good. Onto Raichu Bats. Raichu Bats, I think, is probably, if you get the consistency right, one of the best decks we have in format at the moment. Its matchups across the board, there is nothing it inherently just loses to. It can put up a fight against everything pretty much. Obviously, it's got good EX matchups just because you're pretty much solely non-EX. The only EXs you're really playing are Shaymins. Your attackers are non-EXs, which is really nice. Entei can sometimes be a bit of a worry just because you are reliant on having DCEs. But if you're running Yveltal, which is pretty much a need for Night March as well, you can set up the Raichus with Dark Energy rather than DCEs, meaning that you can completely forget about their Assault Vests. At that point, the 30 damage that they're reducing, it just makes it an EX, meaning you have to do 160. But it's not as difficult as you first think, because if you're running Bats as well and Skyfield, as long as you hit the numbers with Skyfield and things like that, you're going to have a good day. Just because Raichu Bats can, like I've said before, it can reach and knock out EXs really easily. It doesn't need all that much, especially if you can find a really consistent list. Like I said, Yveltal is needed for Night March just because it's one of the only ways you can really conceivably beat that non-EX matchup, just because Yveltal can trade against the Night Marches so nicely, only needs one energy, isn't special energy, and it trades against both of the Night Marches for one prize in one attack, which is really nice. I think the biggest sort of issue with Raichu is just finding a consistent list. If you can find a consistent list, I think you're going to have a good day, just because, like I've said, there's no inherent auto loss. There's nothing it won't put up a fight against. It can always have good damage output. Tina, again, can be a bit of an issue just because they can lock you out of Skyfield, but it's not. They're a very slow deck, and Raichu can be quick, or it can be kind of slow and methodical, and then take 6 prizes in 3 turns. It's a very versatile deck, and I think that's something that it's along with consistency is one of the key things that Raichu has that some of these other decks don't really have.
Yeah, I agree. Matchup wise, like just as you look down the paper, you think matchup wise, Raichu has got to be the most. It has the most good matchups and the least bad matchups, so you'd think it's the best deck to pick. But you are putting stage ones in there. You're playing Raichu and most play Milotic as well, and you're playing some sort of stage 2 line. So it's a lot of Pokemon. That alone can clunk up your deck. It's like playing a Vespiquen deck, but you don't have Battle Compressor to thin out the deck. So yeah, it's your old saying of you've got to get it consistent for it to work. But yeah, it can hit great numbers, good enough to beat any deck just on prize trade alone. So I think it's also a great shout as well. So next up is Seismitoad. There's a bunch of different ways to play Toad. Toadina, probably the most recognized and the most played version. Um, Toad locking stuff out is always going to be good. Um, it's pretty good at just punching its way to victory, stopping people setting up. Hits good numbers on night marches. Like we have Giovanni's scheme now, so you can actually one-hit Pumpkaboos, which is really cool. You just slow down Charizard Entei to the point where they can't do much. Once you get over their initial vests, if they went first, you can do quite well against that. An issue is Manectric Crobat because your output is just not good enough to win that game. Even with Chaos Wheel, that then opens up the door for them to use their trainers, get into more bats, get into headringers, all these other things that they play, which is really worrying for you. So that's probably the hardest matchup, along with Mega Manectric. If they actually set up the Mega, that can be an issue for you. Even when you do go into Giratina, that's when they can switch it up and go into something like Regice, which is a real pain. It loves Lucario Bats. It's pretty good against Raichu Bats because it needs so much to get going, the Raichu Bats deck, and just Toad can punish that really nicely. So, and as well as all those things, like once you hit Giratina against Raichu or against Night March, even to an extent against Yveltal, it could be really painful for them. So that's pretty strong. Then we have Toad Bats, trying to increase your output via the bats to help you out again against Night March. You don't really have like a secondary attacker in that deck. You just have a handful of water energy to hopefully get a grenade hammer to finish games off quickly. So that provides a way around Assault Vest, a way around Giratina, which isn't fantastic, but it's just something, I guess. Toad Bats is way worse in standard than it is in expanded because we don't have free flight Zubat. So there are turns where we miss Turmon Quaking Punch just because we can't even move a little Zubat, which is really frustrating because otherwise I feel like that deck could be really, really strong pick. Then we have Toad Zorro. It's a weird one. Zoroark Floatstone gives you a lot of flexibility, and it also gives you that injection of power you're sort of looking for as a Toad player after being really slow almost the whole game, just using Punch for 50 or 70 with Giovanni. And then Zoroark can come in, use Mind Jack, or steal an attack, because often the Zoroark-based ones play the break as well, to really get over things that you couldn't otherwise with a Toad. So I think that's pretty nice. It almost plays like a Yveltal deck, but it's just really heavy on Toad. So that's an interesting option. I think it's decent for the mirror match against Yveltal Zoroark Gallade, just because their engine is fully based on Acrobike, Male, Compressor, Ultra Ball. So denying that is going to help you in the mirror quite a bit. And then there's also Toad Empoleon, which is one that's popped up a little bit. It's other than, like, instead of having the bats, you basically cut out having that bad starter, but you will still somehow get that injection of damage in the game, and that's by using an Archie build to get into the Empoleon. It means that you don't have space for hammers because they're not insta-play cards, which is unfortunate, but you're going to try and balance it out by getting one, sometimes two, Empoleon out, plus Muscle Band, plus Giovanni again, to the point where you're almost two-hitting with Punch, and that's a really, really scary prospect if you can get it going. So I think Toad can do well against almost anything. Manectric Bats is its hardest matchup, as well as anything with Vespiquen. Vespiquen Vileplume is the hardest matchup, almost guaranteed, because you can't respond on Vespiquens at all. They can completely run through you. And being a Toad deck, even though it is a lock deck, it's really focused itself on items, and they'll just get shut off. So yeah, those are the biggest threats for Toad, I'd say.
Yeah, I think Toad's probably the most versatile card because there's four different ways you can play it, but it does have some scary matchups, and like the last deck we're going to talk about now, of the sort of runners, Vespiquen Vileplume can be difficult. So yeah, the last deck is Vespiquen Vileplume. The biggest kind of downfalls of Vespiquen Vileplume is the list itself. That in it can be really inconsistent, where you can just sort of not hit what you need and have to discard pieces you don't want to discard, and then your opponent can play Hex and Lysander. These kind of things are the biggest issues for Vesper and Vileplume, because when you can lock your opponent into like a red card hand or just a bad hand in general, you're just going to bench them in 2 to 3 turns really, really nicely, just because they don't have the outs to use their Ultra Balls, to use their Battle Compressors and VS Seekers, to use their Trainer's Mails, anything. They are stuck with a hand, and they have to be able to respond out of that hand or rely on a top deck. And when you're dealing with something like Vespiquen that can one-shot EXs on turn 2 or turn 1 with Forest of Giant Plants, it's really scary having to play just completely relying on your top deck, because you're dealing with a non-EX that trades favorably, and you're locked, and you're probably not going to have many more than 1 or 2 Pokemon out on the field at one point, so you are going to have to discard resources just to be able to try and stay in the game. That being said, Lysander can really, really screw this deck over if you can't find your float stones and you feel you have to go for the Vileplume just to slow your opponent down. That in itself can kind of lose you the game, just because they can then sit behind they can Lysander up a Vileplume and make you sit behind it, and they can then just sort of, you're both as locked as one another because you don't have access to your float stones. Another nice way of going about it is the new Yveltal. Its ability, while it's active, negates the use or no tools in play have any effect, so you can still Lysander up the Vileplume even if it's got a float stone on it, and it doesn't have a float stone on it really anymore, because it still has to pay 3 to retreat. You're only running DCE, so you're giving up 2 DCE to do that, and by then you're not in a good place. So yeah, the biggest issues are kind of like Hex and Lysander, just because they can Hex through your ability, your item lock, and sort of set up a board from there, at which point you're kind of hindering yourself a little bit, just because you've given them a turn to do what they want, and now they've got a full board set up and you've got a full board set up. So that can be a bit of a hindrance, but Lysander is another thing that is probably one of the most annoying things for the deck to deal with, because it doesn't play its own Lysanders to get out of the to get out of the Yveltal. It can play AZ 1 to 2 copies, but it's never going to play many more than that. It's probably going to play 1 just because it only has the space for 1 to be able to consistently get a turn 1 Vileplume. And once you've used that AZ, then they've just got to find another Lysander, and then they can do the same. So I think the biggest issues are something that you could come up against in any of the decks, just because every deck is playing 1 to 2 Lysander and 1 to 2 Hex. But anything that isn't prepared for that, or that can't find the Hex and the Lysander when they need it, you're going to have a really good day against, just because the deck can naturally bench your opponent really quickly, because they can set up Vespiquen and enough damage and Vileplume all in one turn with Forest of Giant Plants. It is very reliant on specials, which again is kind of a downside with all of the special hate out there. But it's not looking to take 6 prizes. It's looking to take 2 to 3 knockouts to the point where you don't have any bench anymore. It's not going for the long winning game. It's going for the sort of take quick knockouts to be able to bench your opponent rather than take 6 prizes.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever won a game by taking 6 prizes with that deck. You win a game by taking 2 prizes and they're benched. I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the deck. If you're going second as the Vespiquen Vileplume player and they can just get 3 attackers down, I don't think that I've ever used more than 2 Vespiquen ever with that deck, just because you need to mill through to get to your Vileplume. And you like just don't have that option. You have to get rid of Vespiquen pieces along the way. So if your opponent just gets 3 bench Pokemon down that can all attack and kill Vespies, you're going to lose. I mean, that's a lot to ask for. That's the good thing about it. But it can happen if someone gets red carded into a god hand where they can bench 2 Pokemon and then Sycamore, you've lost the game. It's just one of those things where you can't really counter the deck, but it can just lose just on hands. Like you say, if they have the outs in hand, they win. If they don't, you win. That's just how it is, really. It has a ridiculously high win percentage if you go first. So winning the coin flip is almost the same as winning the game. With a few decks, like definitely against stuff like Charizard Entei, winning the flip can like win you the game like instantly, pretty much, because they have like 40 items. 40. Like, come on.
Mm.
And like only DCE plus blacksmith. And like, how do they get the blacksmith to work if they don't have items? You know, they just lose. Um, um, but there are other decks, even random decks like Raichu that plays Bridget, or like even Gallade Octillery, because they play four Bridget. They have outs into Pokemon, and then they end up fatiguing you for random reasons. But it's just one of those things. If they have the hand, they can beat you, but most of the time they're not going to, because we're shutting off items and we're trying to hit red card as well turn one. So those are the biggest factors of the deck, and that's how it wins its games.
I think another really big issue is being able to sequence right as well. We were talking to Reese the other day. You may have seen that upload, and he was saying how important sequencing was. And if you don't know the sequencing, you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot, because if you don't sequence right, you don't get the turn one Vileplume anywhere near as much. And without the turn one Vileplume, your win percentage going first is severely cut, just because the win percentage going first is based on getting a Vileplume out and your opponent not using trainers. So yeah, sequencing. I think if it's a deck you want to play for ECC, it's practice is probably the most important thing you can do. Not against anything, just sequencing um, in your own head, just to try and work out what the best play is each turn. But yeah, that was just a little side note.
It's almost a good exercise to see if you can mill yourself completely turn one, just to see if you can. I think when I've done dummy hands, I've tried to mill the entire deck just to see if I could. It's actually a useful exercise for that deck. Not that you'd want to in a real game, but to see how far you can go when you have to reach for something. Because I don't know if you've seen it on the channel, but in my last four cards of the deck, I had two DCE, and my other two were prized, and I missed DCE and lost. So it's a good exercise to know how far you can dig with that deck. And yeah, sequencing is huge for it. So you can't just sort of pick it up and go, "Oh hey, this is cool. Let's play it." You need to definitely test that deck, because there are misplays galore, because you do so much in one turn. There's 50 decisions that you have to make in one turn. 50 decisions could at any point be wrong. So yeah, you need to know exactly what you're doing in that deck. So those are the big boys, but we do have a few mentions, actually quite a few mentions. The format's really wide at the moment. And basically we're going to run down, not really, we're going to assume that you know what the decks are doing. Like, we're mainly going to talk about the biggest threats, why these aren't in the top of the billion, why you should be worried about this deck. But you can still, that's not us saying that it's not going to do well. You can't succeed with this deck. It's just the biggest threats for them, really. So the first one I'd like to throw out there is Mega Mewtwo. It's won a couple of cities in the last couple of weeks in the UK. But that's because there's no Night March around in the UK, because Manectric Crobat is everywhere. And Manectric Crobat being everywhere stomps Night March. So Night March is away. So Mewtwo can come in and do really well. So it plays like a Sceptile, and then it tries to tank, and obviously you can't do that when Night March is around. So fingers crossed you don't play Night March if you're playing Mewtwo. Good luck to you, whoever picks up that deck.
Yeah. Next up is Tyrantrum, or like the Bronzong based. I guess the Bronzong based engine on the whole. I think the only way you can play it is Dragon Metal at the moment, just because Giratina and Tyrantrum are both really good attackers. Hexmaniac is the deck's biggest sort of issue, just because it stops Bronzong, and it means you can't chain Tyrantrums. Again, Night March is another thing that can also happily trade against Tyrantrums all day. It needs less energy and does naturally more damage. You're easily overextending with Tyrantrum. It does have non-EX attackers, which makes the matchup slightly nicer. But again, Night March is another deck that can chain Hex 2, 3, 4 turns in a row if it really wants to. And at that point, they've taken, even if you're using your non-EXs, they've taken 2 to 3 prizes. You're always taking one prize at a time. You just lose the game from there. If they can, any deck that can chain Hex is pretty much an issue, just because you need to be able to rely on sort of having other ways to get into your energy. You need to always have the second double dragon, or you always need to have like preemptively attach with Bronzong, things like that. And then anything that can drop a Hex at the right time is also kind of annoying, because it can stop you from attacking for a turn, which can sort of lose your tempo and you can put you behind in the game. So Hex is the biggest issue for the Bronzong. It's Tyrantrum mainly at the moment, but the Bronzong based engine on the whole has its own deck. It's much better as like a thinner line in Night March than running a Bronzong dot deck and trying to use that rather than using it as sort of a subsidiary energy acceleration.
Yeah, I totally agree. So the next deck is Lucario Hammers. It's a really interesting one. It plays like a fatigue deck almost because you have the Karina engine to get you into a bunch of hammers and focus sash. So the idea is that Lucario is never going to die. You try and avoid as many attacks as possible with hammers, with sash, with super scoop ups. But the big downside to this is, of course, Charizard Entei because you get rid of their energy and they blacksmith it back and hit you really hard. And you're never going to do enough damage as the Lucario player on Charizard Entei to win prize trade, so you have literally no option to win that game. So Lucario Hammers, it's an interesting one. It doesn't actually do well against Totina either, unless you play a really high Zerosic and Team Flare Grunt count. You need to play like a 3-1 or a 3-2, or maybe just a 2-2 split of those supporters, and then you're clunking up the deck. So Totina, or just any Toad variant, and Entei are the biggest issues for that deck, but it can squeak out wins just by fatiguing these DCE based decks.
Yeah. Next up is one we mentioned earlier on Gallade Octillery. Despite being Gallade Octillery seems like one of the most consistent decks on the planet of the Earth, just because it's looking at its card it's drawing, and then it's drawing the card. However, because Gallade is a stage 2 for a start, and we're still in an item lock heavy format. So with so many sort of item lockers out there, Vileplume, Toad, which is relatively splashable, it's a real issue if they lock you out of the rare candies from relatively early, because you're going to be only running 1 to 2 Curlier at most, usually only 1. Meaning that you can't get your Gallades out, and without your Gallade you don't have an attacker, and without your attacker you don't take any prizes, you don't win the game. The other thing is kind of the typing, because Sash can sometimes really help the deck because it can lead to knockouts on EXs quite nicely, just because Gallade is taking 2 hits, but you can't attach Sash until your Gallade. You can't attach Sash to a Curlier or a Ralts.
Yeah, you can.
Can you? I didn't know you could. I thought you could only attach it to fighting Pokemon. Oh,
It
there you go.
it only has the effect.
Oh, okay.
But it's a
Well,
fight.
completely ignore that then. I didn't think you could. Even so, popping sashes is still an issue. Sash is a really, really good item tool, which can really sort of swing matchups. It means your Gallades can really tank a lot nicer than you would perhaps think for just like a non-EX. So it can trade relatively favorably against some EXs, but I think the biggest issue is still consistency. It had some wins over in America, and I know Joe tried it out for a little while, but I think its issue was always consistency, just making sure the list was perfect. It's a risky one to play, just because if you have a bad day on consistency and not drawing into what you want, you're not going to win the matchup just because you don't have outs to be able to use Gallade. The fact that Gallade is a stage 2 and you're not arching it, I think is probably is an inherent weakness of the deck.
Yeah, I think playing the deck gave me a lot of experience with it. Like because you need Karina for Candy Gallade so much. Definitely if they are breaking sashes, because there's a lot of decks worried about Charizard Entei right now. So Megaphone goes up in play, and Megaphone then becomes the perfect counter for Focus Sash, which is what that deck really relies on to win its trade. Because those are the turns when they just break a Sash and don't kill you. Those are the turns when you can Lysander up a Shaman and take 2 prizes to really win you the prize trade. That's how the deck wins. You Lysander Shaman, Target Whistle, Lysander Shaman, and then you've taken 4 prizes. They've taken 1.5 because they've killed 1 and broken a Sash. Right, so that's how you win the game. But because they're breaking sashes, and more often you're losing your Gallade pieces quicker, therefore you lose like your Premonition a lot quicker. Then your top decks are worse. Then you are digging more for Gallades. You need to hit your Super Rod at the right time. You need to hit Sacred Ash if you play that as well. I don't actually think that Vespiquen, Vileplume, or Toad are the worst matchups, because it normally plays double Jirachi, and that's really, really good. And it plays well. My one played for Bridget and for Karina, so you're always going to get enough attackers out against Vespiquen Valplume, even if they red card you. I don't. I say always, but I mean, come on. You have a lot of supporter routes, which is a lot more supporter routes than a lot of other decks, at least. So I think it has decent train lock matchups. It just doesn't enjoy bats at all. Bats are the best way to break the sash, and they hit for weakness, and you can't one shot them back a lot of the time. So that's definitely the biggest issue for Glade Octillery, I'd say. And like you say, when you're premonitioning and not seeing the DC that you need, it's just sad times for that deck, and it does happen. You might think it doesn't, but it does. Trust me, it does. So next up is other Vespiquen builds. I'm somewhat of a lover of Vespiquen. I've done well with it in the past. That'll be a variant that I discuss here. The Bats Yveltal deck. It's phenomenal against Night March. It has a really good Totina. These are the two things we know for sure about this Vespiquen deck. But Entei Charizard is a thing, and it completely stomps you. You basically have to play as if you're just baby Yveltal bats, and oftentimes you don't have enough output in the deck. In comparison to the Charizard Entei, I've tried to throw in Bayonet as a tech so that it shuts off Muscle Band and it shuts off Assault Vest, but anyway, they have Lysander, and some even play Catcher. They can just deal with the Bayonet, and then you're back at square one. You can play Evolutions, but again, the Vaporeon can get captured up and killed. The Evolutions build is interesting because you then switch back to having Blacksmith, which is not as reliable as stuff like Bronzong or Baby Veltol. So it's not quite as reliable, which is a shame, but you do conversely have the extra typing. Like you can do really well against Yveltal, like even better than ever before because you have Jolteon in there. And even if they are capturing up Jolteon, then they've not killed your Vespiquen with DCE, which is like great for you because at that point they've got two more Pokemon in your discard pile. You're probably going to hit them for knockouts anyway. So it does have decent enough matchups. It's just overcoming Entei. It's really frustrating because it's a deck that I really would have loved to play for the ECC like a month ago before Entei got big. But it's a real thing that I've tried to test Vespiquen a lot, and I've just not been able to beat Entei consistently enough to warrant me playing the deck.
Yeah, I think Entei is a huge thorn in Vespiquen's side. Um, and yeah, it's led to pretty much Vespiquen Valplume being the only real competitive form of Vespiquen out there at the moment. Next up is a more of a counter deck, Yveltal Regirock, which is a nice niche little deck that a few people have been talking about, not too many. But yeah, its main pro is also its main con. It's a counter deck, so you're going to do well against some of these really popular decks. But if you don't see these really popular decks, if everyone it decides to go rogue, it doesn't. It's a less consistent Yveltal build. Which less consistent is never good. I think inconsistency in the fact it's a counter deck is naturally a pretty glaring weakness of the deck, just because Yveltal is an inherently really strong deck, but it does rely on hitting energy when it quite consistently. It's not a pick up and play deck. You do need to, again, sequencing sometimes can be a thing. You do need to be able to draw through your deck quite quickly, things like that. If your Yveltal deck is then inconsistent with things like Regirock, Energy Switch, things like that, then they're not things like Trainer's Mail and other more sort of four-offs that you could have to build a naturally quick Yveltal list. Though, as I've said, it's a counter deck. So if you think you're going to see pretty much the first 7 or 8 decks we talked about all day, then you're probably going to have a pretty good day, just because it has relatively nice matchups against most of them, really good matchups against one or two. Like naturally, the baby Yveltals are really nice for Night March. Yveltal EX itself is a really good attacker. The Regirock can easily deal with a lot of the inherent weaknesses that Yveltal has, just because of the typing and being able to one-shot the lightning types relatively easily. So it's a really good counter deck, I think. But if you're scared about not seeing what you expect, then you're just going to have an inconsistent Yveltal, and it's just going to lead to a pretty rough day for you, just because inconsistency is never a fun way of not doing well at a tournament.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most annoying things I've tried the deck a little bit, and you just play like two fighting energy and like one Smeargle. There's times where even though you want the Regirock, you think it's more consistent than the Gallade. Its energy is just so awkward. There are times when you're missing the Smeargle, you're missing the energy attachment, and it's kind of slow. Like a lot of your attackers, other than Baby Veltol, like that's your main accelerator, but everything else is DC plus an energy. So once those things start getting killed, it's really awkward for you to sort of come back. So you really need to be careful with your attachments with that deck more than most, I think, at the moment, because it's inherently slower than the other Yveltal build. It tries to sort of catch up by playing its own enhanced hammers. I guess that's how it sort of pulls back in the game and denies people getting knockouts in response. But there's a few issues for the deck, and yeah, I don't think it's perfect by any means. Next up is Mega Ray. Mega Ray can punish quite a few decks. It stays out of range of Entei Charizard really nicely. You can even play the Dragon Rayquaza to tank the first hit, and then you can play one of the new, oh, not the new, the newer, I guess, the secret rare Rayquaza, which has the heal thing to take it back up to full health, and then you basically just win Entei Charizard from there really easily. You can easily beat Yveltal Gallade, in my opinion. But the biggest issue, of course, is going to be Night March and also Raichu and any other deck that just happens to be playing Parallel City. Parallel City is another card that's popping in and out of popularity. I think at the moment it's slightly on the increase because it has actually the secondary effect of minusing 20 damage from fire and water and grass types, so that you have slightly better, if you are the Entei Charizard player, you have better matchups against Toad, and against other decks, you have better matchups against Entei Charizard because they don't hit the right numbers. So just people naturally playing Parallel City in 1 and 2 copies can completely shut down a raid deck for a turn or two, and that's a real issue. And you're just going to get out-traded by Night March, and also Raichu, of course, is going to destroy you. So those are the biggest weaknesses of Ray.
Yeah. Next up, Mega Sceptile, another grass Pokemon that's unfortunately been eaten up by Entei. Entei is pretty another really rough matchup for it. The whole idea of Mega Sceptile is being able to tank and then move and heal, tank, move, heal. Entei can one-shot you relatively consistently because they have DC and Blacksmith. They can one-shot you really nicely. They can tank if they miss the one-shot, meaning that I think the max damage it does is 130. So with poison that's 140. But that's reducing down to 100, so you're not knocking the Entei out. At which point they're two-shotting you. So Entei in general is just a really, really good check for Mega Sceptile, just because it can one-shot or it can two-shot. You're never really going to be one-shotting them back if they've used Flame Screen to start off with. It's really, really difficult. Obviously they don't really run special energy, so Assault Vests aren't important, but at that point they can just stack on sort of muscle bands to do even more damage with Flame Screen. It's not an inherently easy matchup because you have no special energy. It's really difficult to one-shot Enteis, whilst they have a really, really nice time of one-shotting or even two-shotting you if they want to.
Why would they two-shot a Sceptile? They just stomp them. They completely stomp them. They don't need muscle band. They just stomp them with their second attack. Anyway, Primal Groudon is the next one I think I want to discuss. It's one of these decks that you just look down the list and think, oh god, there's so many dodgy ones here. But they're dodgy, but none of them are completely unwinnable. Like, there's been a player in the UK who's kept with Groudon since Nationals, okay? And I played him the other day, and his list has now sort of evolved to the point where still plays multiple Wobbuffet. That alone can win you games. Like, it wins you Vespiquen Vileplume, which is fantastic. It can do really well at just slowing down stuff like Charizard Entei and stuff as well. You're then playing multiple Jirachi, okay? This is to help you out against Giratina. This is to help you out against Vespiquen. It's to help you out against Night March. It's to help you out against anything with specials. Again, it can help out against Entei while you're trying to stall for time, because Groudon is great for stalling for 3 or 4 turns and then coming in and taking big prizes. So playing the Jirachi allows you to get out of Chaos Wheel lock for a turn, which allows you to put down Silent Lab, which allows you to kill it. So you can get over Giratina. That was a big issue for Groudon. You can get over stuff like Night March and stuff just by having Robo Subs for days, Focus Sash, Jirachi, you almost want to fatigue them rather than take the prizes and win that game. So I think you also play like one enhanced hammer and random stuff like that. Um, the only things left then that still beat you, like Night March can still beat you just by having the Milotics or Bronzong. They just, the fatigue doesn't work and then they just overrun you. But the other things, Vespiquen, if people are brave enough to still play Vespi, even if you expect Dente, I think that deck can really stomp you. Sceptile stomps you because it also has the sash breaking thing that the Ariados that poisons, so then you get over focus sash. Yeah, so those are the still biggest issues for Groudon. It doesn't sound too horrible. Everything else can really be awkward but winnable. And the thing is, you don't want to have awkward but winnable matchups. You want to have favorable matchups. And Groudon has a bunch of, it's awkward, but I could try my best at this.
Yeah, it's not something for a big tournament like that. It's not something you really want to be going in with. Okay, I might do okay against some of these decks. You want to be looking at decks you know you're going to do well against. And considering like two or three of the decks Joe talks about there were in our top like 8 or 9, they're things you're going to be seeing, and so it's not matchups you want to be sort of going in open-minded. You want to be going in knowing you're going to win the matchup or knowing you're going to do really well at the matchup rather than just hoping to be able to stall them out. Next up is the other primal, Kyogre. Kyogre Regis Zoroark is another really tanky build, but it's just so slow. It's so slow, and the format is really quick at the moment. Like we've seen Vespiquen be able to do huge damage on in a turn. Night March can take 6 prizes in 4 turns. Yveltal has a really nice matchup just because you have to have so much energy on the board. It's kind of awkward, and then it's also pretty much, well, Primal Kyogre at least is weak to grass, which is not a good type to be weak to at the moment, just because the imminent threat of Vespiquen, whilst it's kind of kept in check with a couple of other things, it's still an issue. It's still something that you want to be wary of because people will be playing Vespiquen at the ECC. Whether it's the right play or the wrong play is like a different question. People will be playing Vespiquen at the ECC, and it's going to mean Primal Kyogre is sort of naturally has an even bigger weakness just because Vespiquens are finding these one-shots on Primal Kyogre so easily and taking 2 prizes for it. Vespiquen is all about the prize trade, and Primal Kyogre just sort of doesn't help that at all just because it's a huge EX that you put so much energy into finding the Primal for and Mega Evolving and then setting up these 4 energy, and it's just taken out in 1 turn by a Vespiquen.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's almost comparable to Mega Manectric. It's just it takes an extra turn, but you have extra tankability. It's one of those trade-offs. I feel like at the moment, if you're going to play Kyogre, I'd advise just playing Mega Manectric just because it's safer. So next up, another Mega that you could potentially play is Mega Houndoom. I think this is really underplayed. I do still believe in Houndoom. I've not yet taken it to a tournament myself, but I think matchup-wise, I think you have a strong Entei Charizard because you can tank hits and dish them out quite easily. You have a strong Yveltal Gallade for the similar reasons. I think you have a definitely winnable Mega Man and regular Manectric. I think you like Manectric bats for sure. You just don't enjoy Toad at all. Toad is really going to struggle. It's going to like destroy you. Definitely Toadina because then you can't go into the Mega or you have to wait around for Hex, which is frustrating. And it's also going to force you into more discards of energy. And the deck is already like reliant on Blacksmith, but when they're using hammers and crushing and enhanced hammers, you're so much more reliant on those blacksmiths, so you probably need to play at least 2. Sometimes it might even be worth playing 3 if you're really worried about Toad. But even then, like the Toad is doing so much damage to you, so that's a real issue. And Night March is still an issue. Like although you do have blacksmith, you can charge up attackers each turn. The majority of your deck is EXs, so they're just going to win prize trade straight up. So it's almost the case that you need to play 2 non-EXs just to keep in the game and still have super rods, but then they just Lysander around you anyway. So I don't feel like it's got a good enough Night March or a good enough Toad to see a lot of play.
Yeah. The other sort of strand of Houndoom is the Mill Houndoom. It's Personally, I'm willing to admit I haven't looked enough into this deck because such an avid fan of Houndoom, I definitely should have given this deck more time. But from what I've seen, the deck just looks. It's another deck that sort of suffers because it's slow. The format, we keep saying it, but the format is so quick at the moment. It's all about Vespiquen is a turn one deck that kind of decides the game in one turn. Night March can decide the game in less than 5 or 6 turns very consistently. And when you're sort of biding a buy by discarding 2 a turn, you're going to lose your 6 prizes before you mill your opponent. Especially with without the only other real mill deck at the moment is in expanded, and that's Sableye Garbodor, and that has access to things like the only reason that deck is really good is Life Dew, and you don't have access to Life Dew, and you're an EX. It's like the double negative because you're losing 2 prizes. The bigger HP isn't really an issue because there's so many things that will one-shot you at the moment, and you're only ever discarding 2 a turn. You do have things like Energy Disruption, but it's not worth it, I don't think. I think the format is a little bit too slow to be able to consistently pull off a mill deck at the moment. I think the only thing that can really do that is in expanded, and that's Sableye Garbodor at the moment. I think it doesn't have the right resources.
Yeah, it's just like even Durant, like Durant could do 4 a turn, right? And that was touch and go whether you won or lost. Houndoom does 2 a turn, so the format has to be slower than it is like an expanded. No, it has to be slower than it was back when Durant was played, and it's in fact the opposite. Like it's way easier to kill stuff. So I don't see it. That you can. I don't see that you can mill people for like 9 rounds consistently. I just don't see it working. Another deck that I don't really fancy is Magnezone Raikou. I feel like the inconsistencies and the weaknesses just there's too many to count in my opinion. Everyone's playing Hex, that can really hurt you. Everyone's playing Lysander, they can kill Magnezones quite easily. Lucario, people are just playing that on its own and they can have good weaknesses on you. A bunch of non-EXs can just, like Night March can still trade 1 for 1 on you, but you have to wait a turn at least to candy into Magnezone, and even then, like it's not guaranteed that you do that. And at any point, they can Lysander kill it. So, you know, it can win prize trades just by being non-EXs if your opponent's not doing the right things and targeting the Magnezone, or if you've somehow created a board state where you don't need Magnezone anymore, like if you've already got 2 Raikou set up, in which case you've drawn into a dream hand, and that's not going to happen every round. So I just don't rate Magnezone Raikou enough to play it. Matchup-wise, I don't think it has more than like 3 good ones.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because it was like a real shining star out of Breakthrough, and it's just sort of succumbed to the slowish format. It's still a stage 2. The stage 2s are making a comeback, but Magnezone is still a stage 2, and that in itself brings its own issues. Next up is Trevenant Gengar, the last one I'm going to be talking about. Another item locker, so another like sort of pretty decent sort of theme, because item lock is always really strong, and then Gengar being able to hit and switch. We know how good Donphan was back when it was so popular. Gengar is sort of a worse version of that just because it's a it is an EX, it's not a non-EX, and it doesn't have all the fighting tools. But the biggest issue for the deck is actually Yveltal, just because it's got okay matchups across the board, bar Yveltal, but there's 3 or 4 decks that can easily run Yveltal as their energy acceleration at the moment, and at that point, baby Yveltals are horrible just because they one-shot Phantom is the baby one. They one-shot Phantoms. Trevenant is weak to it as well, so whilst you're never one-shotting them with a Trevenant, if you need to attack with a Trevenant, you're never really one-shotting them with a Gengar, because Gengar's capped at 80 with the Muscle Band and then 90 with the Poison, so you're not one-shotting them without placing some damage counters first, which is just kind of wasting your own time because you want to be hitting and switching into the item lock. So Yveltal just as a card is such a real issue, purely because it's another card that really trades well just because it's got 130 HP and has weakness on everything in the deck really.
Yeah, it buys you turns whilst helping you win the prize trade, even when you're under the lock. So yeah, pretty good. And obviously, there's still the weaknesses that everyone plays Lysander. They break the lock, and then they can crack on and do whatever they want. So yeah, the final deck we're going to discuss is Wobbuffet Bats. It's one of these decks that people always want to play, but because you have your own Wobbuffets, now your own deck is inconsistent. So you have to hope that your deck can sort of draw better than your opponent just because they're not prepared. Like your deck is going to be more prepared to be under Wobbuffet lock, so you're going to have more compromises in your own deck. You're going to play either a ridiculous speed engine and have recovery, like you could play 4 acro, 4 mail, 4 roller skates, and then just have like 2 super rods to recover the bats that you kill early on. Because I feel like the deck needs to mill so that you can get multiple bats down, right? And then you need to continually get bats to increase your damage. So you play a speed engine like that, or you just play a ridiculous support account of like 10 actual draw supporters, and then on top of that you have your other things. So I mean that doesn't sound too ridiculous, but it's kind of high. Like most decks are playing like 5 draw supporters, and that's 4 Sycamore and then 1, a judge or an ace trainer or something random like that. So going up to 10 is like way higher. So you just have to hope that Wobbuffet can do enough disruption. Oftentimes it can. The bats can help you win Night March surprisingly well. So Night March is actually one of your favored matchups, because Night March without Shaman is actually pretty poor. You can do decent against Entezard, but it takes a lot of bat damage for you to actually take the 6 prizes. If they just keep shunting up Entes, eventually they will hit a Lysander, or they'll just run into their own blacksmith and start dealing with Wobbuffets, which is a pain. You're really bad against Mega Man. Mega Man's like your hardest matchup for sure, because they have rough seas to undo a lot of your bat damage, and they hit the right numbers to kill everything that you play. So those are the biggest issues. And Toad can still be an issue because, like I was saying, you need to compensate for not having Shaman in your own deck. So you're playing a lot of item draw a lot of the time, and then Toad can shut that off, which is a problem. So you just have to really, it's a punt if you want to go with Wobbats, but it can win some games just because Wobbuffet is a thing. And, you have one extra better matchup now because Vespiquen Vileplume might see a lot of play, and you will crush Vespiquen Vileplume, guaranteed.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the other decks. Then not necessarily things you're going to do amazing with. We more pointed out their weaknesses and perhaps something for you to focus on over the next couple of weeks on how to beat those specific weaknesses if you want to play one of the decks that we talked about. But rather than us explaining why they're good, explaining what you can sort of do to deal with potentially bad matchups on the day. But yeah, so I think we've picked out a couple of decks each. So Joe, if you want to, as our sort of choices. So Joe, if you want to start off with one of yours.
Yeah, so my first pick would be Monetric Bats. It's been a real consistent performer, at least in the UK. I know it's done well over in Portugal as well, and it's been doing well in America. Since regionals, it's been doing well. It's survived regionals. It's still topping consistently throughout cities. People have optimized builds. You can hit early damage. You can do big late game swings with its second attack. Just has a lot of options. It always has pretty much 50-50s around. So as long as you can sort out your Entei Zard matchup to be more than like a 40% win rate, I think it's a very good pick.
Yeah, I like Mega Electric. I had a bit of a bad run in it with it at regionals, but I think it was more luck of the draw rather than the deck. The deck always performed. It was just me missing energy, things like that, which is just kind of a luck thing. My first pick would be Night March Milotic. I think it's kind of boring, but it's just so good. It's so consistent. I've been playing with the deck a little bit online just to try and prove to myself that it's not kind of a cheapskate pick, and it is a really, really, really consistent deck. Once you play it, you know why it does so well. It very rarely misses things because it gets down to sort of a 6-7 card deck in one turn, and the last 7 cards in your deck are exactly either things that cycle through your deck for your DCs or whatever, or DCs themselves. So there's just so many sort of outs. With Milotic, you have even more consistency. You can ditch things that you perhaps would be less inclined to things like the single muscle band or the single float stone, you can happily ditch early on because you know you still have access to Milotic later on in case you really need them. And getting back a 5th DCE is really, really strong. And then with AZ, a 6th DCE as well, so you can actually face these non-EX decks really nicely if you really, really have to. I think Night March Milotic has sort of proved to everyone how good it is, just in the fact that it's consistent, it does huge damage for what can sometimes be very little setup. I'm not going to sit here and lie. You do sometimes miss it, but every deck will sometimes miss their optimal play and their optimal setup. It's just so strong, sort of inherently in itself. I think you'd be crazy not to at least consider it.
Yeah, Night March is Mr. Consistent, really, isn't it? It has the compressor engine. It just does what it does in a turn, and you get going. You have the potential to explode and do knockouts on turn one. So it's just Mr. Consistent. I think anyone picking up, like, it shows that a bunch of the other decks in the format right now have to have, like, a barrier of entry for being a good deck is to have an at least manageable Night March matchup. Night March is pretty much governing how the format is run at the moment just because of its speed and its power. So that being said, my last pick is going to be a Yveltal build because Yveltal can handle Night March quite nicely. So you should have quite a good day. Having the Zoroark, having the Gallade, you have answers to almost every deck. As long as you can get into Gallades, I feel like the deck will be played enough. Like, there'll be enough people picking up and playing this deck that someone is going to have, they're going to run hot, and against their Manectric matchups, they're going to hit the Gallades, and therefore they're going to try and, well, they have a much higher chance of winning. So someone running hot with Yveltal, Zoroark, Gallade, I think can beat anyone, you know? If you are hitting Gallades most games, you're winning most games. That's just the way it is, because Premonition sorts out everything as long as you don't misplay. You have so much control of how the pace of the game goes, when you take your prizes. What you're drawing into is like the least of your concerns. So, yeah, I think it's one of the strongest decks that we have, and matchup-wise, it's not too shabby either. I think you need to play Toads to deal with Entei Zard. 1 to 2, I would recommend. So there you go.
Yeah, I think after testing some of the new breakpoint stuff over this past week, I've noticed how important controlling the board is and having a sense of control. And Gallade at the moment is one of the best ways of doing that. It's such a good consistency Pokemon. It helps you. It's always helping you. It's a half decent attacker. It trades really nicely with Shaymins, which can easily finish off a game. I think Gallade is one of the best support Pokemon we have in general at the moment, not even just in this deck, in general. And my final pick is actually going to be Raichu Bats, something I profiled on the channel not too long ago. I've been playing more and more of this deck over the weekend and the past few days, and it's just selling itself to me even more. It's really, really consistent. It's got good EX matchups. Anything that is EX based, it trades well with. Anything that's Yveltal or Rayquaza based, it trades even better with, because you need to do even less to be able to get these one shots against EXs. There are obvious issues with things like Entei and Night March, but as we've already said, you're going to be running it with Yveltals just to deal with both of those, and at that point they're nowhere near as much of an issue. Night March is so much nicer just because of Yveltal. Yveltal is such a really, really good counter to Night March, just because it can trade with Night March so favourably, especially if you're running 2 and then 1 or 2 Sacred Ash and then the Milotic as well. You're going to have enough Yveltals to be able to take, sort of sometimes even outpace them, which is really nice. The important thing with Yveltal Bats is consistency. If you can get not Yveltal Bats, Raichu Bats, the most important thing is consistency. If you have a consistent list, I think you're going to do pretty well, just because Raichu can hit 180. It's not that difficult, especially with Bats, especially with Muscle Band. It's not that difficult, and if you can get a list that consistently do that 3 turns in a row, you're going to take 6 prizes in 3 turns. It's like a bigger Night March. It can do that. It's a lot more it's a lot more difficult, but it's a lot harder to kill than these 30 and 60 HP basics. Raichu is a little bit harder to set up, but even just that 90 HP can sometimes be a little bit awkward. So I think Raichu Bats is definitely. I think I'd struggle to pick between Night March Milotic and Raichu Rats at the moment, just because I think they're both really, really strong. So yeah, I think it's about an hour and 15 minutes. I think so. I think we've talked enough now. Hopefully you found what we've said today useful. Bearing in mind sort of some of the other sort of fringe decks. We wanted to try talking about their weaknesses rather than their strengths, so you guys know how to tech against specific matchups, things like that. If you really want to play one of the decks that isn't what we spoke about at the start of the video. And then for the stuff that we all know how to build a list with, we talked about sort of why they're good, which is always a useful thing to know when going into a big tournament like the ECC. So I'm all done over here. If there's anything you want to say as well, Joe?
This weekend I'm going to Bournemouth Cities on the Saturday, and I'm also going to the Reading pre-release as well. So I'll
Yes,
see you guys there next week.
Breakpoint is out in just over a week's time, so definitely stick with the channel and expect some Breakpoint decks. We're frantically writing out lists at the moment just to try and get as many decks out to you guys. Whilst there's not too much in this set that's groundbreaking, there are some really, really, really good decks. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, keep it here on OmniPoke. We have a lot of breakthrough decks coming at you over the next few days and weeks. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe, talking about the ECC coming up in 3 or 4 weeks' time. And we hope to see you in another video.